Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on Play, a psychological toolkit for optimal music performance delivered by the ISM Trust. I'm Dr. Daubney and with me today is my co-author, Chartered Psychologist Greg Daubney. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few technical points. You may not be able to see us, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. You should also be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. So if you do have any questions, which we hope you do, please type them into the questions box and we'll answer as many as possible towards the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. So on to today. What we're talking about today are some strategies and a kind of overview of our new resource, which is called Play. The information here is provided on the screen about how to download or to, you can also buy a copy, a hard copy. But if you go to ismtrust.org/play, you'll find all of the details, and the things we're talking about today are drawn from this. There's something here about Play and what it is, but basically, as it said, it's a hands-on practical resource. And when we were putting it together, we were thinking about performing musicians of all ages and all standards. And the emphasis is very much on optimal music performance. In other words, trying to get the best out of your music. And so we've drawn on lots of psychological and philosophical research, but from across music and sport. And there's lots of practical ideas which are integrated for you into your practice and performance. We've put lots of illustrative examples in to try and help you to understand how it might be used in your own context, because obviously there's a lot of flexibility around that. It's not something necessary to pick up and read from cover to cover. You might want to pick it up and put it down, and we'll look today at how it's organised and how you might want to use it. Basically, this work's developed from an earlier piece of work that we did for music teachers. Across my career in music, I'm a typical, I suppose, portfolio musician and teacher, but we were trying to find originally a way to help teachers to help embed psychological skills throughout their work. So the publication that's on the screen at the moment that you'll see is the original work that we did, and there's something on there about the workshops which we have also used across the UK. And this work has now developed into us doing something on performers, which is Play itself. Play explores lots of facets of well, being a musician, I suppose. We're trying to look at it from a kind of optimal, this is how you make things really good perspective, rather than always dwelling on something that's negative. But as you can see, it talks about fear of failure, fear of success, self-awareness, self-regulation, all sorts of things, deliberate practice, stage fright, pressure, commitment, being aware of where you are at the moment and trying to look for musical immersion and optimal performance. So there's quite a few different things that you can see on the screen, some of which I've just mentioned.
And the resource itself, we've drawn the strategies from lots of different research, from lots of different philosophies coming to psychological approaches. So, for example, there's a list here coming up now about all the different types of philosophical approaches that we've used and drawn information and strategies from when forming the strategies to place within this resource. And the reason why we've done that is that we've tried to provide as broad an expanse as possible so that we get and you get as much coverage from all the different philosophical and psychological approaches as we possibly could. And that leads me into consideration of how the booklet itself is devised. So what we've done is we've kind of imagined Play as being a bit like a film camera, really focused in intensely on the individual musician. And we started with the first section been called You as Performer. And this section really considers a lot of the presenting symptoms of things that may actually get in the way of you as a musician performing optimally. So the things there might be physiological, for example, such as sweaty hands, that kind of thing. It may be cognitive, it may be your thoughts, or it may even be some behaviours. So that first section is designed to look at the strategies that you can put in place more immediately to help cope with those symptoms. And then it also starts to look a little bit deeper, moving into realms of your beliefs and how to become more immersed in the music, before moving into the second section of the toolkit, which is called your musical self. So this part starts to look a little bit more reflectively at you, who you are, how you got to where you are, and then thinking also about perhaps where you are going as well. So if we imagine that film camera is just sort of panning back, taking a slightly wider view, because there may be some sources of stress that maybe might not have been considered immediately at that point. And then we've got the final section of the booklet as well, which then looks at the environment surrounding you as the musician. And this takes the widest view of all. The camera, if you like, has then fully panned back. And what we will be looking at, what it looks at really, is the potential sources of stress that may be existing within your environment, which might actually then be stopping you from reaching your optimal music performance time after time. But until you actually take time to reflect on the impact of the wider environment, it may well not have come across your radar. So it may be something that you've not thought about, or it may be something that you have thought about, but perhaps haven't got practical strategies as to how to handle it the best. And what we'll do in a moment is we'll run through each of the three different parts of this booklet, to give you a bit more in-depth consideration of each of these three areas. But first of all, just wanted to introduce how the strategies have been considered. So we've devised 6 different types of strategies. Now, all the strategies are very practical, hands-on, but they're also designed to all be practiced. Now, when we're talking about practicing these strategies, what we're actually talking about is some of them need to be practiced in a practice setting, such as the ones at the top there. Sometimes the strategies are designed to be practiced, but may be used just before you start performance. Some of them move on then to help you during your performance. And we then have some that are there to be used immediately following your performance, to help with recovery at that point. And then we have 2 wider types of strategies that ask you to consider perhaps the role of your lifestyle in relation to optimal music performance and how that might be impacting you. So for example, it might be the amount of sleep or your diet, the amount of energy that you have. And then we also have reflection type strategies that just ask you to pause and take a little step back and take a bit of time out, if you like, just to reflect on your music and your performance.
I think one of the key things about these strategies is that they're very flexible, and it's about finding the right strategy for the right situation, and that everybody will have their own preferred things that they want to use or that will work for them or might not work for them, so being playful with them, as the title of the publication suggests, is really where we're coming from. There's a lot there for people to try out.
Yeah, and within the booklet itself, what we've tried to do is where we've put in place a strategy, then we try to give an example of when to use that type of strategy, the type of strategy that it is, and how long to use that strategy for. So the type of strategy in the example box we've got here is actually a practice strategy. So it's to be used in a practice setting. The example is, when would this be used? Well, here we can see that we use it on every practice session, so that we're continuously embedding it into our practice and our routines. And when and for how long we use it, we look here at saying, well, it's between 5 and 10 minutes at the start of each practice session. So we know specifically mentally when we're going to use this strategy to help us. And with the psychology of this, what we've looked at is really, what are the psychological steps to optimal music performance? And with that, we've looked at the psychology behind optimal performance. And really, the strategies are designed to have several aims. So the first one is they're helping us to focus attention on items that are really going to help you perform well, rather than ones that are not. And part of that is about being able to accept distractions. It's also about becoming fully immersed in the music, and then, as I mentioned earlier, taking perhaps a wider perspective on music within your life. And the ultimate aim is to enhance your understanding of your musical life, how you got here, where you are, where you're going, and to be able to harness the power of the environment surrounding you.
So we're going to move on to look at the first part of the booklet. And in the session today, we can really only give you quite a brief overview of the strategies that are there, but we've picked out a few that we think we can make work when we can't see you and you can't see us. So we've got some ideas here to share with you that are some of the strategies from the booklet. You as performer, as Greg was saying, this is really your close-up film shot. So it's your immediately presenting symptoms, and it takes a slightly wider view of the underlying causes within an individual in any performing context, whether that be something that you're doing individually or something that you might be working with other musicians. It might be in practice, it might be in performance. So to give you an overview, I'm going to pass over to Greg.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the first half is really looking at trying to handle the immediately presenting symptoms that you might experience as you're about to perform, or perhaps during performance, or immediately following a performance. So it's how to handle those symptoms. And the second part just goes a little bit deeper, so it's actually trying to get you a bit more immersed in the music and understanding how you achieve optimal music performance by becoming much more immersed within that music. And I think an area that is often overlooked within music performance is about post-performance recovery. Now, in sport, they're really starting to pick up on this over the past few years, very much so in relation to the use of ice baths, for example, after sports people have performed, in order to help reduce the lactic acid buildup in the legs and help the mental and physical recovery. And so for musicians, that can also be the case, that because you're often required to do a lot of performance, having a good warm down routine can be vital for preserving your long-term, both mental and physical health. Particularly mental-wise, it's really useful to avoid immediate evaluation of what's just happened during your performance, because you're going to be very emotionally involved with it at that point.
And to put this into context, what we're talking about when we're talking about optimal music performance is for people of all skill levels. So for example, and I know lots of musicians wear lots of hats and they work as teachers as well as musicians, but for example, walking out of an audition or an examination, and the first thing that I've seen as a teacher with students is, although it might have gone really, really well, they're quite stressed and they immediately just burst into tears. So, there's things like that, or when you've really worked towards something and it's the last night and it's come towards a long run, all of that kind of is post-performance recovery. But even in kind of a small scale, when you've got students who are in school who are just doing something very small in front of just their classmates, the way that you feel about it afterwards, is often something that they will then immediately evaluate. So it's about avoiding that, but not completely. It's just about parking it for now.
Yeah, and so we said we wanted to bring in some exercises and strategies that you could use, and we've got the first one here, which is a part of one of the strategies taken from the toolkit. So this is about creating a warm down routine that works for you as a musician. And what we're going to do now is just run through this very brief exercise. Obviously, you can't see us whether we're actually doing this warm down routine, but trust me, we are.
And our friends from the ISM will be too.
Yeah. So, first of all, what I want you to do is just get comfortable, and then I want you to stretch your arms out in front of you and interlock your hands and fingers. And then we just want you to stretch your arms, hands and fingers as far as is comfortable to feel the stretch. So that you then feel the stretch in your shoulders, your arms, your hands and fingers. And do this for the count of 3. So 1, 2, 3. And then release. Just let your arms go back to the normal resting position. And what we're doing with this is just saying, well, your body has been involved in performance. It's a very physical activity, and so is your mind. And having a warm down routine is a very useful way to just stretch out those muscles that, when they're cooling down, really want to shorten very quickly. And this is one section of the routine that we have, which is actually a full body routine. So it incorporates all aspects of your body that you've been using for performance. And the great thing with routines is that they're very useful and helpful, not only for physical health, but actually for creating greater certainty. And certainty in performance is really useful for helping to remove anxiety, because anxiety really breeds when there's uncertainty of what's going to happen and what's going on. So knowing that you've got a warm down routine that you are going to follow immediately following the performance when you've got the opportunity is a great way to avoid the anxiety that comes along with uncertainty. And as we can see here, this is the strategy box that we've put in place for this post-performance routine. And we can see here then that it's a post-performance in the type of strategy. And when we do it, it's after every performance. So we get into a regular routine of doing it. So it's consistent, we know it's happening, and we know it's definitely going to happen. And it's a minimum of 5 to 10 minutes. And ideally, we should be using it after every practice as well as every performance. So although it is a post-performance routine, we do want to practice it in our practice sessions too.
We're going to move on to have a look at some beliefs. So we all have beliefs, and your beliefs can have a significant impact on how you think and feel before, during or after a performance. We need to think of performance as often performing, so we think of the whole process as well as just working towards or going through an event where we perform itself. But here's an example of a belief. My performance has to be technically perfect in order to be worthwhile. And this is something I think performers of all age and all skill level, you hear it coming across. I made a mistake, there was a slip. Whether anybody else kind of noticed it or not, therefore, it may be a conscious or unconscious belief. And what we need to do is to think about our beliefs very carefully and to try and uncover some of the kind of harder ones. So, in order to challenge some of the beliefs, we have to think about what the beliefs are. So here's an example. This belief, my performance has to be technically perfect in order to be worthwhile. Well, the first thing we need to think about is it a helpful belief or is it an unhelpful belief? And if it's an unhelpful belief, to think about what would a more helpful belief be? So, for example, my performance can still be very worthy even if it isn't technically perfect. And we need to think about reflecting on our beliefs regularly.
And we should also be very aware that actually changing your belief is really difficult. It's not something that's just straightforward, and once you've found your belief and it's not helpful, once you try to change it, it's not just going to be something that will immediately change. The probability is that you've held that belief for a long time. If you weren't aware of it and it took some time to uncover, then it's going to be quite rigidly held and potentially deeply buried. And as a result, trying to change that belief will take a lot of practice, constantly making yourself aware of that belief, constantly being aware if that belief is impacting you at any particular time, and then changing that belief into a new one, which hopefully will then become more helpful. So it's really a long-term project that you have to do in order to gain the full benefits from being able to challenge and change your beliefs.
And within the Play toolkits, we've got various strategies in there around beliefs, which help you to explore your beliefs and then to think about the helpfulness of beliefs, and then to think about things that you might be able to do to help you challenge the beliefs in the future and potentially think about things in different ways. Okay, so the next section, as Greg said, if you take a wider perspective, so the kind of second section of the booklet, if you like, is about your musical self. So this is where the camera's panned back a bit for you to consider you at the moment.
And what it's really looking at is questions like, how did you get here? What was your development like? How have you managed to get to this position? So we're starting to move away from immediately just looking at what's exactly is going on here and saying, well, is there anything that's happened in the past that might be impacting me from performing optimally right at this moment? And then it could be about, well, where is here and what actually is happening? So we're considering a little bit more reflectively, what's going on in the present moment. And also vitally important is about, well, where are you going? This question of what is your development like? What goals are you looking to achieve? Why are you looking to achieve them? What's the future like from your musical self? And what we're trying to do really is to encourage musicians to take a bit of perspective. And the reason for that is that perspective allows us to consider factors that influence our musical performance, but that perhaps we might not be aware of, or we may have been aware of, but we were just ignoring it. And that might be part of the reason why we may be reaching suboptimal performance. And when we're looking at the future, we're looking really to say, well, yes, you can have a future destination, and that's good. And normally when people think about what they're trying to achieve, that will be the outcome that they're looking for. That's their destination. But it's actually also about being really getting into a position where we're really going to enjoy the ride getting to that destination. And that's one of the strategies here that we're just going to have a look at now.
So strategy 10 from the toolkit is called Enjoy the Ride, and it's adapted from acceptance and commitment therapy. And so with the strategy, I'm just going to read out for you the strategy itself for you to kind of think about. So imagine that Anne and Bill are being taken to a concert at a local theatre. Both are very excited at the prospect of getting to the concert to enjoy the music to be played. Anne focuses solely on getting to the theatre. Whenever the car stops en route at traffic lights or gets stuck in the traffic, Anne becomes agitated. She wants to get to the theatre, which is her outcome, and is frustrated and disappointed in not getting there as fast as she wants. Like Anne, Bill is also very excited by the prospect of the event. However, Bill realises that in order to get to the theatre, there may be some delays and hold-ups over which he has no control. These are the same hold-ups as Anne experiences. After all, they're in the car together. Bill therefore accepts that these hold-ups may occur and decides to look around at the scenery as it goes by. Bill notices that it is a lovely warm day and he watches the blue skies as they drive to the theatre. Bill looks around at the other drivers on the road and smiles at some of the other passengers as they travel. Both Anne and Bill get caught up in the same traffic and arrive at the theatre at the same time. However, Anne has a wretched time getting there. She has been poked and prodded by her emotions so that she is angry, hot and frustrated on arrival. Bill, on the other hand, has actually enjoyed his journey, even though it has taken him slightly longer to get there. He still arrives very excited at the prospect of experiencing the music and can't wait for the concert to begin. He's very excited and feeling that he's going to have a good day.
So we see with that example, what we're suggesting is that the way that you get to a destination is almost as important as actually getting to the destination itself. So it's all part of the development that the musician experiences, and therefore the enjoyment that comes from the development.
So there are quite a few strategies in the booklet which look at that kind of area. But now we're going to move on in our brief whistle-stop tour from today to look at the environments. And basically this is where the camera is pulled right back. It's the widest view, thinking of the interaction between the individual and their environment, and kind of now, in the future and in the past, and how all of these things kind of go together. So there are various sources of stress. Here are some examples. So we've got peers, for example, and we hear this quite a lot from musicians that we work with who suffer quite badly from kind of looking at their peers and giving themselves feelings of I'm not good enough. So kind of social comparison, all sorts of things actually around peers. There's also potential sources of environmental stress from family in all sorts of different ways. Venues themselves can have quite a lot of uncertainty. You don't know what it's going to be like. You may have been there in the past and not had a good experience. So as Greg was saying, the mind kind of chews away at uncertainty. So, you know, where you're going and what you're doing, and the kind of the event itself in the venue is also a source of environmental stress. Audiences, we hear this quite a bit about the role of the audience and how the audience and the perception of the audience can be really stressful. And there are actually lots of examples where audiences are extremely supportive and they are there to support and, you know, want the best for the musicians, but often that's not the perception, and there can be examples of audiences causing environmental stress. And then the music itself, of course, got something quite difficult coming up. I'm halfway through playing. I know I'm going to get to bar 27 in a minute. Oh dear, here we go. So, you know, the music itself, how that might relate to the event. You know, we play music in lots of different situations, and that itself can bring around kind of emotional ideas. And, you know, so we need to think about these.
Yeah, and oftentimes we don't often think of something getting in the way of us performing optimally that is necessarily outside of ourselves a lot of the time, unless it's immediately obvious. You know, a lot of what we're looking at here is the interaction between that individual and their environment, and taking the time once again to kind of step back and say, what can we do? How can we help? What strategies can we put in place that make this interaction between us and the environment more helpful and more productive?
So we're going to move on to look at a couple of ways of thinking about it. So there's, I mean, they overlap. So although they're drawn here on the pie chart, there are actually, you know, elements of these which overlap. And you can look at this diagram and think, oh, that's nice, they're all even. But actually, in real life, in different situations, in different contexts and at different times, the balance of the environmental stress might be quite different. So, for example, in this example that you can see in front of you, the environmental stress is mostly being caused by the audience, a little by peers, somewhat less by family, and then only marginally by the music or the venue itself.
Yeah, and when we look at this, first of all, we'd have to take some time to reflect on what is causing us potentially the greatest stress, and perhaps what is having the biggest impact on me not performing optimally at this time. So, for example, here it would be the audience. But as Ali was saying, that may just be at this point in time. It may not always be the case. So an individual with this kind of pie chart would probably look to say, well, okay, I'll work and prioritize a strategy that helps me handle my interaction with the audience in a much more effective way. Whether that be the way they think about the audience, whether the way they handle their emotions in relation to how they feel about the audience. But then what would happen is that obviously would then shrink that element, and then it may be the case that some other element might take over, and they may feel that they need to then prioritize working on a strategy that perhaps helps them cope with the venue itself. So this is a constantly changing dynamic here. It's not a case that we would suggest, you work on every single strategy that's contained within the toolkit because they're there. It's a case of trying to work out, well, what is happening to me at this moment in time, and which is going to be my most effective strategy to help me to perform optimally more and more often in the future. So we were looking at expectations when considering potentially family, peers, significant others, and ourselves. We put in place a strategy to consider the impact of expectations on how you may be able to perform optimally in the future. And we wanted to explore expectations by helping to think through a series of questions which were relating to expectations of self, for example. So it may be, what expectations do I have of myself as a musician? Just taking the time to just step back and reflect on those kind of expectations. And it may be then that it's the expectations of others that are having an impact and potentially stopping the musician from reaching their optimal performance. So they may ask, well, what expectations do I think other people have of me as a musician? And how valid are those expectations? What can I do myself to influence those expectations, if at all? Oftentimes it may be just a reflection alone and bringing that to the forefront that might actually make a big difference. And then there's the impact of prior expectations from self and others, and this requires an element of reflection by the musician, looking back, for example, over the past year, and really sort of contemplating, well, actually, whose expectations have I most frequently been trying to meet? Are they mine? Are they somebody else's who's important to me? So just taking the time to stand back and consider those can have a big impact, as well as potentially what future expectations the musician might have of themselves. So really like looking forward to the next year, what expectations do I have of myself, taking into account specifically the demands that I have on my time. And those kind of ideas and taking the time to reflect can really have a significant impact on the effectiveness of your performance. And so reflection strategies, oftentimes here with this one, when you can do them is often when you have the time to reflect. It's often something that we don't take enough time to do, is to reflect on how we are performing, what's influencing us, where does music sit within our lives. Again, this type of strategy that we just looked at, again, is a reflection strategy. And the duration, how long should it be practiced? Well, it's such a variable strategy, really. It's impossible to know or to give any specific absolute requirement, and it will vary depending on your circumstances. But a minimum of 10 minutes, whenever it's required, is a useful amount of time as a beginner, just to start to take some time to reflect.
So we'll be taking some questions quite soon, and if you've got any questions, it would be great if you could start putting those up for us. In the meantime, there's just a few more things that we wanted to kind of share. There's a lot of help out there, and I think since really 2016, the mental health and well-being of musicians is really starting to come to the fore much more, which is great. And so actually there's a signposting section within the toolkit, which some of the organisations and places that you can go for help have been put up here for you. For example, the ISM, who we're with today, and the ISM Trust, their members have access to a 24-hour helpline as part of their membership. And there's also up here BAPAM. We haven't really touched today on drugs and alcohol, but there's different charities and places that you can go to for help on that, and it's certainly things that we hear about and that we touch on within our toolkit. So Samaritans, Mind, Help Musicians UK, and then also the British Psychological Society.
And it is important, I think, to mention that the toolkit itself has not been designed as a be-all and end-all. If what you're experiencing really is beyond the realms of the strategies that are in place there, then professional help should always be sought. We're not trying to put something in place that moves away from that. Certainly, as a chartered psychologist, I'd always recommend seeking assistance if it's needed.
So we've got some parting thoughts that we want to share really before we move on to taking some questions. And there's a quote here that says, "Just like with diet and exercise regimes, we set out with good intentions, but we might lack the commitment and effort to really work at the changes over a sustained period of time. Nobody can give you that effort. It's just an ingredient that only you can apply. But with the effort comes the increased understanding of the psychological flexibility that you need to be effective as a musical performer in many contexts, and using the skills you draw from our toolkit when required." So really that's kind of one of the things we thought about very much, is around trying to help people understand that they need the flexibility with the strategies, with themselves. They're giving themselves permission to go away and work at things. And also that they, these things don't happen overnight, and to be able to change things, you need to put in sustained effort. And there's something we were talking about actually on the train today coming up, where we were thinking about how much effort do you put into various aspects of developing as a performer. And if you thought about a percentage of how important do you think psychological skills are, I suppose, for a start, do you think they're equally as important as other skills that you develop as a performer? And then secondly, I suppose, thinking about what is the effort that you actually put into developing across your life the psychological skills and flexibility that you need in order to be effective.
With very much with psychological skills that are there to help you improve your performances, they should be very much thought about in the same way as you might think about developing technical or physical skills. For example, the amount of effort and the self-guided deliberateness, if I can get that word out, deliberateness of your practice is very key to the development of effective strategies for helping you to produce your optimal performance.
Then some other things to think about really. Well, hopefully this has kind of come through about what we've just been saying, but we don't believe that psychological skills are sticking plasters. Basically, they need to be embedded in the long term. And that's why with the toolkit, it really is about looking at things in the kind of long term, the medium term, leading up to performances, then during and after performances, but also kind of across your life.
And then secondly, very much is this case of really don't let your mind prevent you from practicing these strategies. These strategies are research-based, they're evidence-based, so they're shown to have a high element of effectiveness when implemented. And oftentimes what will happen is that your mind will maybe try to convince you that maybe you don't need this, and maybe it's too hard work, or maybe you could do something else instead, or this is a bit of a waste of time, or why are you practicing this? You should be practicing your music. That's what your mind is very good at doing. It's very good at directing you away from some things that will really help you to reach your optimal performance. So what we'd say is understand that that's going to happen, but then don't let the mind take you away from it. And a very good way of doing that is to have fun with the strategies. Although we've written them down in the toolkit itself as they are there to be modified by you so that they become really effective for you in your own environment and in your own context. You don't have to stick rigidly to exactly what's written. The aim is that that's a guiding strategy idea, and you can then play around with it to make it so that it's much more personal to you, and hopefully, as we say, have fun.
So I'm going to give a quick plug for a workshop that Greg and I will be running in June. We've run a lot of workshops actually around the UK with the ISM Trust, and quite a few here in London at Bayswater. And this particular day, which is on June the 21st, will run in Bayswater at the ISM with just 14 people. And it's a format that we developed last year when working with teachers, which has been highly successful for actually talking about lots of stuff, but also doing lots of hands-on kind of practical running through things and showing people how they might actually work. So the details are on here for the toolkit. It's £52 for ISM members and £62 for non-members, and it includes a free copy of Play in the printed format, which is just being reprinted at the moment. So that's great. And to book, you need to go to ism.org/seminars. But as I said, there are only 14 places, and we know from experience they tend to go quite quickly. So we look forward to hopefully inviting people on that day. We also have just printed out here the details of how to get hold of our work. So as we mentioned earlier, ismtrust.org/play for things around the toolkit. And then to download the teacher's guide, which we produced last year, ism.org/performance-anxiety-guide. And then if you also go to the webinars site here, ismtrust.org/webinars, you can see examples of other webinars which will be coming up. And also, as we said at the beginning, the webinars are recorded for people to go back to. So as we move on to the final slide, we're going to take some questions. And I can see already there's a question come in, which our lovely friend from the ISM is just making the screen bigger for us so that we can read the question. So if you bear with us while you think of your own questions, and we'd be really happy to take them.
Here we go.
Right, it's looking more promising. Sorry about the delay.
Looks like a good question about some less than positive rumination going on.
We're still trying to get access to the question. I don't know if we can just click on that part there and read it as we go through. So this question has come from possibly Mark, but I can only see half the names, so thank you. But it says, could you discuss strategies for keeping the reflection process positive, i.e. resisting less than positive rumination?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because our minds are, well, there's quite a bit of research which suggests that our minds love to think in the negative much more so than in the positive. So trying to keep that reflection process positive can be quite difficult. And and the way to do that really is to try to create a good structured framework for reflection. So for example, keeping your questions positive in nature, and also where you do get negative thoughts or reflections, perhaps then moving from that to suggest, well, this is what I'm thinking. How can I improve what I've highlighted as not being very good, as being negative? What can I put in place that will transform what I've just done into something that's much more positive in nature? But it's not an easy process, and certainly when you start, reflection itself can be quite difficult. In addition to that, though, there's also another strategy that you could use, which we've put in the toolkit itself, which is about, rather than necessarily saying whether a thought is negative or it's positive, is just allowing those thoughts to come through and then providing a bit of a buffer with those thoughts. So one way to do that is to just say the statement, I'm having a thought that says, before your actual thought. So, for example, your thought might be, oh, I'm really bad at performing. And then you could say, well, I'm having a thought that says, oh, I'm really bad at performing. And what that does is that it just provides you with a little bit of breathing space and a little bit of time in order to evaluate, well, is this thought helpful to me at this moment in time? And you can then say, well, if it is, then I can use it. And if it isn't, I can say, okay, what's next in my reflection? So that's one way. You could also potentially just sing your thoughts as that comes through. So you could have a thought that says, oh, I'm terrible at performing to a big audience.
So stop and listen to the thought for a moment. I'm terrible at performing to a big audience, and think about how that makes you feel, because actually it's quite a draining thought. And this was something we were doing actually at our workshop on Monday, which is about thinking about dealing with thoughts in different ways. But if you ask somebody to then say or sing the thought in a different way, so for example, what was your thought again? I'm terrible at performing to an audience. Yeah. I'm terrible at performing to a big audience, or I'm terrible at performing to a big audience. So saying and singing thoughts in different ways makes you think about thoughts in different ways and changing relationships with thoughts.
Yeah, and ultimately what you're doing there is also just removing yourself from being stuck to that thought, from just accepting that when that thought is there, that is true, that's real, that's absolutely everything, that is you. What it's trying to do is to just, and what it does is that it removes you directly from the believability of that thought.
So what this is also doing is trying to get away from a traditional CBT kind of approach.
Yeah, so that's one way. I mean, the traditional CBT kind of approach would be necessarily to perhaps change that thought that you might have had when you're reflecting. If it's negative, then you might try and change that thought so that it becomes a positive thought. But the exercise that we've just demonstrated is a way of saying, well, actually, you don't need to spend that time fighting the thought and changing it. Maybe we could change the relationship that we actually have with that thought itself.
And that's not to say that where a reframing kind of approach of a thought works, then there's anything wrong with that. But I think you just need to have lots of different ways to be able to do that, because obviously for some people, kind of to take a thought and reframe it in the opposite and then justify it can be something that they can work with. And for other people, they find that quite unbelievable, so they need to find other ways to do things. So thank you for your question, Mark. Does anybody else have a question for us?
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so we'll just give you about 20 seconds to see if there's any further questions that you've thought of that you might like to discuss. As we said at the beginning, Greg's a chartered psychologist, so it's a great opportunity to kind of pick his wealth of experience on things. I can't see anything else coming in, so we've bamboozled our audience into silence, which is always a great thing. I love that tip for working with teenagers. Works brilliantly when working with teenagers, and I think part of it is teenagers have become so accustomed. Teenagers who I've taught, for example, they've been so accustomed to this idea of they're going to say something negative, and I'm going to go, oh no, I'm rubbish at something. Oh, you're not. Everything's fine. Oh no, I really am. So there's this kind of argument going on with them, and it kind of really throws them off when you then say, okay, I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to try and get you to think about your thoughts so that we're not just having this kind of learnt argument. So Eleanor is asking us if we've got any other top tips for working with hormonal and busy teenagers. Okay, so I'm going to talk actually a little bit about something that that we have done working with hormonal and busy teenagers, because actually a course that we ran earlier in the year talked about when we worked with teenagers and their teachers, we looked at the values which they held about music and why they did it. And it was very, very interesting to actually sit down and do a values exercise with this group of teenagers who were committed to music, but they didn't necessarily think of what they valued in music as the way that their teachers valued it, and actually trying to just get these things into the open in the first instance to work out what they valued. And I guess somewhat unsurprisingly, but things that the teachers didn't put down were things around feeling like a musician, feeling like they had a group of peers who understood them and understood their musical world. So I would say my top tip would be sitting down and talking to them and trying to work out what it is that makes them tick around music and why they do things. There was a lot there about sociability and what that kind of sense of community and achievement meant to them. So that's one.
Yeah, and another idea that you could try with busy teenagers, for example, is just to try to work out with them something like a practice planner. So just something that they can commit to, which says, you know, for 30 minutes here, or for an hour here, or for 20 minutes here, I am going to schedule in a little bit of time where I can then practice these particular strategies. I mean, it is very difficult, obviously, with teens when they're busy and there's lots of activities already planned. But it's about, again, coming back to those values about what they're doing with their music, why they're playing music, is also probably likely to be something that they value very much, and therefore is something that they would want to engage with a little bit more. So it's, sometimes it is just about actually finding time in their schedule and identifying that with them, to which they can then commit to actually doing something.
I think something else, Eleanor, is to go to the Performance Anxiety, a practical guide for music teachers, which is free to download on the website, and that's got loads of different things that you can use flexibly, and it's also got a lot of photocopyable resources, so hopefully that might help you. We've got another question coming from Rosemary saying, how does warming down help with certainty?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, Rosemary. I think what we're looking at here is having a process that we know as a performer what process we're going to follow. So we have the pre-performance stage, we have the performance stage, and then we have the post-performance stage. And as part of that post-performance, what we're doing is saying, well, we know what we're going to do after the performance, and that's going to involve a warm down. And what we're doing there is putting in place specific routines, which just helps the mind know that once the performance is finished, this is what we do. And part of that is we warm down. Obviously, it wouldn't be the full extent of everything that goes on after the performance, but it's a useful thing to have in there, also very much from a physical perspective as well as a psychological perspective.
So I think that's all on the questions as far as I can see. So thank you very much for joining us today. If you have got any other questions, then please do send them into the ISM, and we'd be delighted to try and answer them for you. And thank you. We've got to thank you on the screen from Eleanor. So if you want to contact the ISM with any questions, then that's absolutely fine. We'd be delighted to hear some feedback on Play, ismtrust.org/play. There's a couple of strategies on that site for people to be able to go and look at as a kind of taster into the resource itself. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.